I think we need to gain clarity on the terms in which it is posed: science and trust. That's why I started a new center at Columbia University, the Trust Collaboratory, dedicated to research on trust in science and experts. As you can tell from the name, I also think that collaboration, public engagement is essential to understanding trust. So let me start with science. I think that posing the matter as a question of trust in science is wrong. The issue is not science, but regulatory science. Next slide, please. I liken it to the middle lane in the three-lane highway. Basic science is on the right hand. It's the slow lane because it operates with a reversible sort of time. You can always run the experiment or the simulation again. Policy and politics, on the other hand, is the left-hand fast lane because it needs to reach a decision in unidirectional time. Regulatory science is in the middle, where the slow and the fast, the reversible and the irreversible, need to adjust to one another. Next slide, please. That's why the characteristic device of regulatory science is cutoffs and thresholds. For example, when is a lake acidic? The cutoff is designed to trigger a decision in unidirectional time, but it also constantly gets revised because it's essentially a probabilistic forecast. Consider climate change forecasts. Next slide, please. Should the threshold be 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius? Maybe it must be by now only 1 degree Celsius. The answer depends only partly on what basic science tells us, and a lot also on values and on economic, legal, and political considerations. All of this means that people can have a lot of good reasons for doubting or disagreeing with regulatory science. They may think that the cutoff should be somewhere else, or they may wonder why it keeps changing. And the response cannot be to label them science deniers or to characterize the problem as one of mis or disinformation. I may be a little bit provocative in saying that I think that's wrong and counterproductive. Next slide, please. I think fighting misinformation is a little bit like playing a whack-a-mole, but with a collateral damage. And the damage being that in the process, you alienate people and you make experts appear paternalistic. And this brings me to trust. Instead of being mesmerized by mistrust, we need to have some clarity about what trust is and some realism about how difficult it is to trust regulatory science. Next slide, please. I emphasized the element of time before when talking about the three-lane highway, because trust, too, is strongly dependent on time. And this is kind of my main message. Trust is like music. Timing, speed, rhythm, tempo, sequence, duration, repetition, what comes after what, when, how quickly or slowly, for how long. These are not incidental issues when it comes to trust. They are at the heart of the matter. That's why it's so hard to trust regulatory science. If the cutoffs change too quickly, too often, or in the wrong sequence, they appear like arbitrary decisions. Now let's see what the debate about climate change and sustainability looks like from this perspective. We tell people that they need to make huge and irreversible changes right now, as quickly as possible, for the sake of something that will take a very long time to unfold. Moreover, we tell them that they need to do so on the advice of people that they do not know, have never heard from before, who have suddenly parachuted into their lives, and who are not likely to be around when the consequences of following this advice will materialize. This is diametrically opposed to everything we know about trust. Almost every culture has a saying about how trust takes a long time to build. Trust building is incremental and slow. It requires taking small steps, for each of which there should be very concrete and fairly immediate results that confirm the wisdom and the benevolence of the trustee. Moreover, the trustee should be somebody who is familiar, who is clearly committed to staying around for the long haul, and who only began asking people for this change after it was clear that she was staying there for the long haul. So we can bemoan the lack of trust and blame misinformation. We can even talk about solution aversion, which I think is more realistic, but we would be severely underestimating what a tall order it is to secure trust in climate change regulation. Instead of focusing on the gap between science and action, I want to conclude by talking about the gap between expert systems and the people with whom they interact. Trust in expert systems depends on what happens at the access points of this system, where its low-level, front-facing staff interacts with ordinary people. This is why when New York City was in the midst of the pandemic, and there was a concern about vaccination rates, we started working with community health workers, CHWs. The idea was that because of their intermediary position, CHWs know more about trust than we do. They are trust workers. This is why we designed this photo voice exhibition where CHWs talked about their understanding of trust and illustrated it with the photos that they took. But one also has to recognize that the intermediary staff has mixed incentives. For the expert system to be trusted, the people working at the access points, like CHWs, need to be trusted themselves. But for them to be trusted, they cannot appear as puppets and parrots of the expert system. They need to be able to signal their distance from it. And the more they are ignored and marginalized, the more this will happen. So a comprehensive approach will need to empower these intermediary workers, include them in decision-making, give them control over crafting the message they need to transmit, and frankly, pay them better. A similar approach is also necessary for climate regulation and environmental sustainability. The IPCC, the expert system that aggregates local measurements and issues risk assessments, has been too distant and needs to work on its access points and on the intermediary staff there. That's where meaningful progress can be made. Thank you.